Mom's wedding control disaster drove my sister away, costing us 2 grandchildren and nearly destroying our family. When my sister, Emily, announced she was getting married, it should have been a joyous occasion. Our family, on the surface, was what people might call all-American. We were the picture-perfect example of a middle-class family from the suburbs. 2 parents, 3 kids, a dog, and a white picket fence. My parents, Janet and Mike, worked hard to give us a comfortable life. Dad was a blue-collar worker. Mom stayed at home to raise us, and they prided themselves on instilling traditional values in their children. But those values, mixed with a stubborn refusal to compromise, would be the very things that tore us apart. The trouble began when Emily, the middle child and the apple of my parents' eyes, decided to marry Mark. He was a good guy, down to earth, with a stable job and a calm demeanor that balanced Emily's sometimes erratic energy. But there was one issue. Mark wasn't from our town, wasn't part of our close-knit community, and worse, he had a different background. He was from a different part of the country, a city no less, and his family was less traditional, more liberal. That didn't sit well with my parents, especially my mom. Mom had this idea that everything should be done her way, the right way, which was code for how it's always been done in our family. And when Mark's family suggested incorporating some of their traditions into the wedding, Mom went ballistic. This was supposed to be Emily's day, but Mom made it all about her. She refused to budge on anything from the location to the guest list to the menu. It had to be in our town, at the church where we'd all been baptized, with a guest list approved by her, and a menu that matched her tastes. Emily, to her credit, tried to keep the peace. She agreed to most of Mom's demands, even though it was clear she wanted something different. She wanted a small, intimate ceremony with a reception at a vineyard, something simple and elegant. But Mom insisted on a big church wedding with a reception at the country club. Emily eventually caved, trying to avoid conflict, but it was clear she was unhappy. Things took a turn for the worse when Mark's family tried to include one of their traditions, a special reading during the ceremony. It was something they'd done for generations, and Mark's mother felt strongly about it. But when they brought it up with my mom, she dismissed it outright. She claimed it didn't fit with our traditional ceremony and that it was unnecessary. When Mark's mother pressed the issue, Mom accused her of trying to take over the wedding. That was when the real feud started. 4 weeks leading up to the wedding, the tension in our house was unbearable. Mom and Dad would argue late into the night, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our old house. Emily tried to stay out of it, but it was clear she was stressed. Mark, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over, but Mom was having none of it. She saw any compromise as a defeat, and in her mind, she was defending our family's honor. The day of the wedding was a disaster. Everything looked perfect on the surface. The church was decorated beautifully, the guests arrived on time, and Emily looked stunning in her dress. But beneath the surface, there was a tension that everyone could feel. During the ceremony, when it came time for the special reading from Mark's family, Mom made a point of glaring at them the entire time. The reading, which should have been a touching moment, was ruined by the palpable hostility in the air. At the reception, things went from bad to worse. Mark's family was seated at a table near the back, far from the head table where my parents sat. It was a subtle but clear message that they weren't considered part of the inner circle. The seating arrangement had been a point of contention for weeks, and when Mark's father finally confronted my dad about it, an argument broke out. It started quietly, but soon everyone at the nearby tables could hear. By the time the cake was cut, the argument had escalated to the point where both families were barely speaking to each other. Emily spent most of the reception in tears, trying to hold it together for the sake of appearances. But the damage had been done. What should have been the happiest day of her life was marred by the stubbornness and pride of our parents. First update. I wish I could say things got better after the wedding, but that's not how life works. The rift between our families only deepened. Emily and Mark moved to his hometown, partly to get away from the tension, but that only made things worse. Mom saw it as a betrayal, as if Emily was choosing Mark's family over ours. The phone calls became less frequent, and when they did talk, it always ended in an argument. It didn't help that Emily and Mark decided to start their own traditions, different from the ones we grew up with. They spent Thanksgiving with his family instead of ours, and for Christmas they took a trip out of state instead of coming home. Mom took it as a personal affront. She'd always been the one to host holidays, insisting that everyone gather at our house for big meals and forced family bonding. When Emily didn't show up, it was like a dagger to her heart. She refused to acknowledge that maybe Emily wanted something different, that maybe she was trying to create her own life with her husband. Dad, to his credit, tried to stay out of it, but he wasn't much help either. He would tell Mom to let it go and stop making such a big deal out of everything, but then he'd turn around and complain to me about how Emily was breaking their hearts by staying away. It was a no-win situation. As for me, I was stuck in the middle. I wasn't about to take sides, but that didn't stop Mom from trying to drag me into it. She'd ask me to talk to Emily to convince her to come home, as if I had any power in the situation. I tried to stay neutral, but it was exhausting. Every conversation with Mom turned into a rant about how Emily was ruining the family, how Mark was a bad influence, and how everything was falling apart. I started avoiding her calls just to get some peace. Emily and I kept in touch, but it wasn't the same. She was busy with her new life, and I could tell she was trying to distance herself from the drama. I didn't blame her, but it hurt all the same. We'd always been close growing up, but now it felt like we were drifting apart and there was nothing I could do about it. Second update. The situation came to a head at the next family gathering, a 4th of July barbecue that Mom insisted on hosting. She'd been planning it for months, going all out with decorations, food, and invitations. She even managed to guilt Emily into coming, though it was clear Emily wasn't thrilled about it. Mark was working and couldn't make it, which Mom saw as yet another snub, even though he had a legitimate reason. From the moment Emily walked through the door, the tension was thick. Mom was on edge, trying too hard to be cheerful, while Emily was clearly uncomfortable. The rest of us tried to keep things light, but it was like walking on eggshells. Every comment, every gesture seemed loaded with meaning. And then it happened. We were all sitting around the table halfway through the meal when Mom made a snide remark about Mark not being there. Something about how some people don't prioritize family, and that was all it took. Emily snapped. She stood up, slammed her napkin on the table, and let loose years of pent-up frustration. She accused Mom of being controlling, of refusing to let her live her own life, of driving a wedge between her and the family. It was the most emotional I'd ever seen her, and for a moment, there was dead silence at the table. Then Mom started crying, the kind of deep, guttural sobs that made everyone uncomfortable. Dad tried to comfort her, but she pushed him away, wailing about how she was a terrible mother, how she'd lost her daughter, how everything was ruined. It was a spectacle, and I could see the neighbors peeking over the fence trying to figure out what was going on. Emily left shortly after that without saying goodbye to anyone. She just got in her car and drove away. I haven't seen her in person since. Final update. It's been a year since that disastrous 4th of July, and things are still strained. Emily and Mark are expecting their first child, but they haven't told Mom and Dad. I found out through a mutual friend and had to break the news to them. Mom was devastated, convinced that she was being punished for all the mistakes she made as a parent. Dad was more pragmatic, saying that maybe it was for the best, that Emily needed space to figure things out on her own. But it's clear they're both heartbroken. The baby was supposed to be a new beginning, a way to bring the family back together, but instead, it's just another reminder of how far apart we've all drifted. I've tried to reach out to Emily, but she's keeping her distance. She says she needs time, that she's focusing on her new family, and I respect that. But it hurts to see how much we've lost. Mom has retreated into herself, spending more time in her garden, avoiding social gatherings, and rarely leaving the house except for essential errands. She stopped hosting the family dinners she used to love, and the house feels emptier without the constant buzz of activity. Dad tries to keep things normal, but even he's grown quieter, more resigned to the situation. It's as if they've both aged a decade in the past year, weighed down by the loss of the family they once knew. For a while, I kept hoping things would get better, that maybe the birth of the baby would soften everyone's hearts and bring us all back together. But as the months passed, it became clear that the wounds were too deep. Emily didn't reach out, and when the baby was born, she didn't even send a photo to Mom and Dad. I got a brief, polite message with a picture of the baby, a beautiful little girl named Grace, but that was it. I tried to play mediator to convince Emily to let Mom and Dad be a part of Grace's life, but she was firm. She said she needed to protect her family, that she couldn't subject her daughter to the same toxic dynamics she grew up with. I couldn't argue with her, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. I love my niece, even though I've only seen her in pictures, and it breaks my heart that she may never know her grandparents. Mom and Dad may not be perfect, but they love their family fiercely, and I know they would have doted on Grace if given the chance. But Emily's decision is final, and I have to respect that, even if it means watching my parents suffer in silence. Thanksgiving came and went without a word from Emily. Christmas was even harder. Mom tried to put on a brave face, decorating the house and cooking a big meal, but the empty chair at the table was a constant reminder of how much things had changed. We went through the motions, exchanging gifts and making small talk, but there was no joy in it. The holiday felt hollow, a shadow of what it used to be. As time went on, I started to come to terms with the reality of the situation. Emily wasn't going to come back, at least not anytime soon, and our family was never going to be the same. It was a hard pill to swallow, but I knew I had to accept it if I was going to move forward. I focused on my own life, my own career, and tried to be there for my parents as much as I could. But there was always a sense of loss hanging over us, a feeling that something irreplaceable had been broken. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from Emily. It was a few weeks after Grace's first birthday, and I hadn't expected to hear from her. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as she told me that she wanted to talk. She was coming to town for a work trip and asked if I could meet her for coffee. I agreed, unsure of what to expect. When we met, Emily looked different. Older, more tired, but also more resolved. She told me that she'd been doing a lot of thinking, that she missed our family, but she couldn't go back to the way things were. She said she wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, but it had to be on her terms. She couldn't deal with Mom and Dad's expectations or the pressure to conform to their idea of what family should be. She needed space and she needed me to understand that. I told her I did. I told her I missed her, that I missed the closeness we used to have, and that I wanted to be a part of her life, whatever that looked like. We talked for a long time, catching up on everything we'd missed in each other's lives. It was a tentative step forward, but it was something. We agreed to stay in touch, to take things one day at a time. After that, Emily and I started talking more regularly. We exchanged texts, had the occasional phone call, and even met up a couple more times when she was in town. It wasn't the same as it used to be, but it was better than nothing. I kept our conversations private, not wanting to stir up more drama with Mom and Dad, but I could see that they noticed. Mom would ask about Emily, trying to hide the hope in her voice, but I kept my answers vague. I didn't want to give her false hope, knowing that Emily still wasn't ready to reconcile with them. Months went by and slowly things started to change. Emily became more open, sharing more about her life with Mark and Grace. She even sent a couple of photos of Grace playing in the park, and I could see how much she'd grown. It felt like a fragile truce, a tentative beginning of something new, and I cherished it. But Mom and Dad's relationship with Emily remained strained. They still hadn't met Grace, and every time I visited, the tension in the house was palpable. Mom had stopped asking about Emily, but I knew it was still weighing on her. The house felt colder, quieter, as if a part of it had died when Emily left. The final blow came when Emily announced she was pregnant with her second child. She called me first, excited and nervous, and I could hear the happiness in her voice. But when I asked if she'd told Mom and Dad, she hesitated. She said she wasn't sure if she was ready to deal with their reaction, that she didn't want to go through the same drama as before. I understood, but I also knew that this news would devastate Mom and Dad even more. When I finally told them, Mom didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, staring at the wall, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. Dad tried to comfort her, but it was clear that they both felt completely cut off from their daughter's life. They were losing another grandchild, and there was nothing they could do about it. I wished I could fix things, but I knew it wasn't up to me. The distance between Emily and our parents had grown too wide, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be bridged. All I could do was try to be there for both sides, to keep some semblance of a connection alive, even if it was fragile and strained. Epilogue. As I write this, it's been 2 years since Emily and I started rebuilding our relationship. She's now the mother of 2 beautiful children, and though our parents have yet to meet them, I've managed to become a small part of their lives. I visit when I can, send gifts for birthdays, and keep in touch through phone calls and texts. It's not the family dynamic I imagined growing up, but it's the best we can manage under the circumstances. Mom and Dad have come to terms with the fact that they may never have the close relationship with Emily and her family that they once hoped for. It's been hard for them, especially for Mom, who always dreamed of a big, close-knit family. But they've learned to let go, to accept that some things are beyond their control. They've found new ways to find joy, focusing on their hobbies and spending time with their friends, even as the pain of losing their daughter lingers in the background. As for me, I've learned that family is complicated, messy, and sometimes painful. We all have our flaws, our stubbornness, our inability to see past our own perspective. But I've also learned that love can endure, even in the most difficult circumstances. It may not look the way we expect it, but it's there, in the small moments of connection, in the willingness to try again, to rebuild even when it seems impossible. I don't know what the future holds for our family, but I've come to accept that it may never be what it once was. And that's okay. We're all doing the best we can, and sometimes that has to be enough.